Hello, my gentle and of course very modern apes. My name is Erica. Welcome to Gutsick Gibbon, where we alternate between science videos and the Sisyphusian task of debunking pseudoscience like young Earth creationism.
It's a full-time job, and it's extremely time-consuming, and it's not as easy as it may appear to some people.
Who cares about silly old young Earth creationism, you might be saying, while overwhelmingly preferring those videos over the science videos according to the YouTube algorithm. I like to talk about young Earth creationism, one, because it gives me an opportunity to shoehorn in science topics in a fun, sort of debunking style way, but two, because, well, it's still around, isn't it? I'm simply here to act as a young Earth creationism watchdog in case any of these wackos in government decide to make defeating evolution their flagship idea so they can shove young Earth creationism or creationism in general back into the public consciousness. Am I paranoid? Hopefully. That is the lofty, big picture goal. The everyday goal of all of this, the everyday reason, as I have said before, is that dunking on young Earth creationism is both fun and it is funny. And that brings me to the video that we're covering today, Debunking Radiometric Dating and the Heat Problem by our friends Tweedledee and Tweedledipit.
We're confident that this one is going to be, it's not going to be countered by the critics, put it that way, because the rescue devices, they've been dealt with. We dealt with them here.
Wow.
There is no heat problem.
There is no heat problem. There is no heat problem.
I try my best not to bother with this channel, but it's just like junk food to me. I keep coming back because it's just such easy, low-hanging fruit. And also, people click on those videos, and I gotta pay a mortgage. Eat your heart out, Donnie. Your stupidity lines my pockets. Now, I believe that any idea, no matter how goofy or silly, deserves a fair shakedown. We should look at ideas and analyze them for scientific accuracy and for robusticity. That is so long as the presenter of said idea is a good faith actor. They actually believe the ideas they're putting forward and want to have an honest dialogue. Bad faith actors should be ignored once their ideas are systematically broken down into their smallest parts, and then those ideas should be ridiculed. I believe that Donnie and his partner in crime, Ramat, known fraud, fall into the bad faith actor category. And so today I think we're probably gonna hurt some feelings. We will be as ruthless as the stupidity permits.
You know what? I am not as mean as I would like to be. And I really wish people appreciated that more.
Now, okay, like, what is this video about? Their video is meant to debunk the heat problem and the radiation problem, as well as radiometric dating. Three things that are highly problematic for the young Earth creationist idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old and that Noah's flood is responsible for at least 500 million years worth of the geologic column. Now, I'm sure you guys already know what radiometric dating is and what the heat problem is and what the radiation problem is, but I'm going to briefly explain them anyways. In case some of you are new, I'm very sorry if you are. Radiometric dating is simply the means by which we glean an absolute age for a given rock sample. When igneous rocks form, they contain a certain amount of radioactive isotopes in them, and some of these radioactive isotopes categorically are unstable, so they will decay at a known rate in time into a more stable daughter product. This is called the parent-to-daughter ratio. When these igneous rocks form, they are all parent, and when they're all done decaying, they are all daughter. So then we just have to take a rock sample and look at the parent material, the daughter material, and apply the rate at which decay occurs, and we can get the age that that rock formed. So uranium-238 decays into lead-206, and the half-life of this is approximately 4.5 billion years. So if we get a rock sample and it's half uranium-238 and half lead, we know one half-life has passed and that this rock formed 4.5 billion years ago. The problems that creationists generally have with radiometric dating is they propose that we make lots of assumptions. The only assumptions that are really present in radiometric dating is that the radioactive decay law is in action, like physics is occurring as it should. that rocks are all parent when they form, which we see rocks today, and we've never seen the opposite happen, like it forms all daughter. We know that it's all daughter when it finishes decaying. We've seen the decay chains of numerous different types of unstable elements, and they always end once all daughter has been achieved. And then that the decay rate is constant. Yes, we assume that the decay rate is constant because we cannot get it to not be constant, and that would be enormously huge for the energy industry worldwide. So radiometric dating is solid. We also know this because the global industry for fossil fuels uses radiometric dating to base and model and actually extract fossil fuels, so our economy relies on this. And given radiometric dating gives very old ages for the age of the Earth, and indeed every stratum of the geologic column within all being pretty much older than 6,000 years, this is a problem for young Earth creationists. And so, as a result, they try to cope with it.
In order to explain why all our radiometric dates show the Earth to be very old, young Earth creationists suggest that during the flood of Noah, something very radical happened in the realm of physics that caused radiometric decay, remember that law in physics from earlier, to accelerate by several orders of magnitude. This would allow them to stand by an Earth that is 6,000 years old, despite much older universal nuclear dates. There are several problems with this, but the big one is that nuclear decay releases heat. So cramming 4.5 to 4.8 billion years of heat release into 1 year results in enough heat to vaporize the granitic crust of the planet several times over, something a wooden boat obviously would not survive because the planet would essentially be a ball of plasma goo. But accelerating decay also leads to 4.5 to 4.8 billion years of radiation being released, which would certainly destroy all life on Earth down to the smallest microbe, and also, of course, everything on Noah's boat. Answers in Genesis proposes that all the tectonic plates also move to their current position during the single year of the flood, adding even more heat due to the friction of continents moving at race car speeds atop the mantle. Additionally, impact events must all occur during this year, which adds enough heat on its own to nearly boil the world's oceans. All of this combined, of course, is the heat problem, and depending on what flood model is being proposed, leads to either enough heat to vaporize the granitic crust of the Earth several times over at minimum, and at maximum is equivalent to 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs, for a total of 2.2 times 10 raised 38 ergs of energy. Answers in Genesis subscribes to the model yielding that smaller amount of heat, but admits that at present, it requires a miracle from God to fix.
Okay, so now you're caught up. The video we're looking at today by two random guys on YouTube is going to be attempting to debunk radiometric dating and solve both the radiation problem and the heat problem, two issues that the big organizations still supporting young Earth creationism across the United States today cannot solve. But these two guys are going to do it. Now, the way that this thing is kind of split up is it's two 30-minute presentations by Matt and Donnie, followed by an open dialogue. And Matt, known fraud, certified goblin, and former breatharian, is going to start us off. So buckle up.
This presentation is going to go over the radiometric dating in the age of the Earth, because we know that the only reliable evidence that they have that the Earth is millions of years old comes down to radiometric dating.
Wow. Wrong. Off to a really strong start. The ancient age of the Earth has been known in sort of a scientific sense since 1830 with Charles Lyell, the father of modern geology. He basically looked around and noticed that today it takes a really long time for things to erode and deposit, meaning today's modern structures in geology likely took a long time to form, thus proposing that the Earth is very ancient. He did propose that the present was the key to the past, this idea of uniformitarianism, but today geologists hold to actualism, which allows for both these kind of consistent processes proposed by Lyell and also local catastrophes that happen today. Anything that happens today is effectively fair game when it comes to explaining different structures in geology that we see in the past. Lyell also thought that the Earth was only millions of years old, not the billions that we appreciate now.
That said, there are 4 assumptions that go into this.
This slide is really poorly constructed, contains arguments, not assumptions, and basically just boils down to radiometric dating is the only reason why people think the Earth is billions of years old, which is just silly. Radiometric dating certainly helps make that case, but it runs in conjunction with numerous other natural rates, including deposition, erosion, weathering, coral accumulation, varves, tree rings, ice cores, evaporites, and many, many more.
So again, we see that the time changed in the 1920s. The age of the Earth crept up to 3 billion years from the age that was before that was set.
Matt makes PowerPoint slides exactly how he writes. Thanks so much for putting a screenshot of a live science Google result. Not even the page, just the Google result itself. This is at least a little bit better, marginally better, than putting blue hyperlinks into a book.
But again, if we look over here, what did they say? Well, the accepted ages for rock layers was set in the 1830s. So a long time ago, 120 years later, radiometric dating ages were accepted, but only if they matched the geologic column. So we see that they already had the mindset of deep time, and they needed things to prove it and validate it. So radiometric dating became that thing that they needed to help validate.
Huh? He just spent the first minute and a half arguing that radiometric dating is the only reason why people think that the Earth is very old. Now he starts talking about how radiometric dating had to match earlier ancient ages in order to be accepted. Well, which is it? Why do we think the Earth is old, Matt? Is it radiometric dating? Is it geologic rates? Or is it both? If radiometric dating isn't the reason why we think Earth is very ancient, then Matt is going to need to cough up some reasons why that original methodology based off of geologic rates is wrong in and of itself. I think that really this turns out to just be a convoluted way of trying to avoid the brute fact that radiometric dating, which was developed after Lyell's work showing that the Earth is very ancient, just corroborated that earlier work, matching the prediction, the gold standard of science. But moreover, where's the source that he provides to say that radiometric dates were thrown out if they didn't match earlier ages? I'm going to assume that because Matt is a known fraud and has tried to fake a published paper, that unless he does provide a source, he's just lying to me.
Now, of course, the age of the Earth is even older because of Zircon crystals and testing that, which we'll get into.
Zircon crystals, eh?
Because of Zircon crystals.
Zircon crystals?
Zircon crystals.
Zircon crystals, Matt? He's gonna do it. This is the guy. He's gonna debunk a foundational concept in geology and physics.
So the assumption has always been that when a supernova or the Big Bang occurred, there was nothing but pure uranium, and that all of the elements that we see on Earth and in stars and on the moon and on meteorites, it resulted from the decay of uranium. So again, that's starting with an assumption.
Oh my god, this is gonna be such a long video. Okay, so the Big Bang is thought to be responsible for helium and hydrogen. Uranium and many other elements that are heavier than lead are primarily formed through rapid neutron capture, which occurs in supernovae and neutron star mergers. But many of the other elements, indeed the life-forming ones, are formed in different ways. Low-mass stars, supernovae, cosmic ray fission, and exploding white dwarfs. And while the elements that make up our Earth were formed in the past, elements are also formed today where and when these events occur. So, no, all elements did not actually come from uranium during a time period where everything was uranium, like the Big Bang or a supernova, as if those events are somehow equivalent. And also, not every element is a part of the uranium decay chain, Matt. He's got a picture of it right there.
They want deep time to be true, so they wouldn't assume that all of these other elements were created at exactly the same time, because that's the uniformitarian belief, is that everything that we see now is you take it backwards in time, and that's what's the most true, right? Nothing can change that.
Ah yes, they want deep time to be true. This is an interesting insight into how Matt thinks and reasons, assuming he does that, and one that he seems to be projecting onto conventional science.
Therefore, they don't believe in accelerated nuclear decay.
Now, Simpson, because of your many years as a nuclear technician, we're putting you on a nuclear sub.
Nuclear. It's pronounced nuclear.
Whatever. Nuclear.
They don't believe that the rates can ever be changed. They believe in uniformitarianism, and they believe that everything started out as uranium. So that is key to understanding what's going on.
No, science doesn't accept accelerated nuclear decay because it's a YEC invention with exactly zero data supporting it at all whatsoever, literally none. Now, Rahman and Standing for Truth are going to try to present data that they think supports accelerated nuclear decay to the degree that they require it, and we will explain how categorically it does not.
But there's a problem with that idea, which we have. It's called the lead paradox. There's more lead than can be accounted for by the age of the Earth, and matter of fact, the age of the entire universe. So meaning, if uranium really was decaying into lead, then why is there so much lead? There's more lead than there should be. It's a paradox for them to comprehend and to grasp what's going on.
The lead paradox was a geologic mystery involving the amount of lead in the mantle, namely that there was too much of it. Rahman is citing a paper from 2008 here, and as is all too often the case when young Earth creationists are citing sources, a solution to the lead paradox is presented in the paper he's citing. This was also elaborated on by Maltese and Metzger in 2020, and then by Liu et al. In 2022.
Walt Brown predicted, matter of fact, that the elements were formed by a piezoelectric effect, and they all formed at the same time. That's how God would have created these things. And his predictions we'll get into in a minute.
Walt Brown is the hydroplate guy. There are two general big hypotheses or flood models that creationists put forward. One is CPT, that's accepted by like AIG and all those guys, Ken Ham. And then you got hydroplate, that's Walt Brown's model. His model produces the heat equivalent of 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs. Those are, of course, his numbers, and his predictions of hydroplate theory include such classics as Earth is shrinking and rock ice is salty.
We can see that there are such things as accelerated nuclear decay. We've seen it in laboratories, we've seen it in experiments, and we've seen it in observational things like in nature. We've seen one of them in particular in Africa, I believe it is.
Yeah, so we haven't seen accelerated nuclear decay as creationists envision it, full stop, anywhere, ever. It has not happened. And I've seen this video already, so I know where Rahman's gonna take this, and it's like the definition of schizo posting. He is just vomiting up whatever word salad he can to try to make it sound like his arguments make sense, and it is just jumbled nonsense.
But we'll get into that one as well soon. But here's one that gives you a billion-fold acceleration of nuclear radioactivity in a laboratory. He says, this is John, what is this? Woodmarep? Here I report the experimental demonstration of radioactive decay rates accelerated by an astonishing 9 orders of magnitude. This acceleration can occur under beta decay. More recently, beta decay has been experimentally demonstrated in rhenium to osmium system. So this method is one of the isotope clocks used by uniformitarian geologists to supposedly date rocks. The experiment involved the circulation of fully ionized iridium in the storage ring. So here we read, the ions were found to decay to a measurable extent in only several hours, amounting to a half-life of only 33 years. This represents a staggering billion-fold increase over the conventional half-life, which is 42, what is this, giga-anium a billion with 10 to the 9th power, which is 9 zeros following a 10. That's how fast we witnessed rapidly decaying things in observational. So when people say, there's no such thing as accelerated nuclear decay, it would destroy all life and everything. Well, we have these things that are already been observed.
Oh, hey, I remember that one. I covered it in my heat problem video from like 2 years ago. This is going to be a running theme for Rahman and Donnie's piece here. They're just reasserting old arguments, a classic example of the Donnie Deals fallacy. It really makes you wonder if perhaps Rahman has experienced some kind of brain damage from his past as a breatharian, those folks who believed that you could just breathe your food and you don't have to actually eat. and that somehow this has impacted his ability to create new memories. The rhenium osmium experiment by Bosch et al. In 1996, as well as another frequently misused study by Cappeller et al. In 1989, were first employed by John Woodmerap, a famous young Earth creationist, on the Answers in Genesis website all the way back in 2001. So yes, Ramat is citing a 20-year-old young Earth creationist article to support his idea of accelerated nuclear decay. But the Bosch et al. Study does exist outside of young Earth creationism, so let's take a look at it again. The Bosch study successfully reduced the rhenium half-life from 43 billion years to just 33 years. Well, that sounds really impressive and sounds exactly like what Ramat is looking for. They can just take the methods applied to the study and say that process happened in the global crust of the Earth. So how did Bosch and colleagues do it? Why, they simply manually stripped rhenium of all its electrons using a particle accelerator, an experimental storage ring, and a dozen or so other steps that includes the application of 370 million electron volts and removal using foil. In Ramat's stated article, Woodmerap refers to these as special conditions, which, yeah, I'd say so. In fact, these special conditions ultimately require rhenium to be in a plasma state, as stated by Woodmerap, and in a natural setting, these conditions are hypothesized to be found in the bellies of modern superhot stars and during the Big Bang. Woodmerap appreciates this actually and notes that for lutetium's accelerated nuclear decay, you would need the temperature to increase to 200 degrees Kelvin, which is 13 times hotter than the core of the sun. So, I don't know about that one, boys.
That sucks.
Additionally, it's not even really accelerated nuclear decay, is it? It's not speeding up the process. This would be like saying you could accelerate ice cream's melting by taking away 9/10 of the bowl of ice cream. So, we just need to heat the crust of the Earth during Noah's flood to a temperature 13 times hotter than the core of the sun, the plasma state, in order to initiate the accelerated nuclear decay. And then the accelerated nuclear decay happens, which is just the regular heat problem. This is like a guy fixing his overheated air conditioner by hitting it with 13 nukes.
So when Walt Brown made this prediction, none of this existed yet as far as observational science, right? There was no concept of like, well, we know that in stars that was believed that, heavy elements could be formed. But Walt Brown predicted that they could form even on Earth, and that's what we actually found, and they don't form in stars. Now we know that they can't produce anything of these super heavy elements that was predicted beforehand.
Now, as far as Walt Brown's predictions go, Ramat, you stupid weasel, these predictions are public, right? He has them on his website, and there's nothing about a rhenium osmium experiment in here, or anything really about stars or star formation.
And we know because of the Proton 21 laboratories in Ukraine.
Okay, so the Proton 21 lab is a laboratory that used to exist in Kiev, Ukraine. It is not, to my knowledge, still active, and what they attempted to do there was mimic the conditions of nucleosynthesis, which is something that happens in the bellies of stars.
When we go through the studies and we witnessed what they did, they would put a piece of metal in a chamber, copper or something, and they would take a piece of lightning and they would strike it. And it would form different elements based on the Z-pinch was a high voltage form of electricity like lightning, and it would burst and it would form different elements. But the unique thing is when it would form these elements, they would rapidly decay. And down here on the bottom, you can see that I highlighted the long-living isotopes of super heavy chemical elements are found in the products of laboratory nuclear synthesis. So what that means is they produced super heavy elements and they rapidly decayed into the elements that we now see on the Earth. So it didn't just produce uranium, which was predicted by the evolutionary model, and then had to decay from there. Instead, it produced all of the elements that we have on Earth today in the same proportions that we have. So when we see it and we see, cobalt, and we see thorium, and we see uranium in something, we go, wow, look at that. The proportions are exactly what we are seeing.
I know what he thinks he's arguing. And I think Ramat is confusing super heavy elements and elements. Super heavy elements are these sort of precursors that have only been created in labs to the heavy elements. They rapidly decay, having a half-life like within the minutes, into known heavy elements, so things that are heavier than lead. Heavy elements are what we actually find in the crust of the Earth today. I think he thinks he's providing support for accelerated nuclear decay because the super heavy elements rapidly decayed into the heavy elements. But this is just business as usual. That's their normal half-life. It's very short. Heavy elements are much more stable comparatively and have much longer half-lives. So what the Proton 21 lab showed is that you can get the conditions that we see in Earth with regards to the proportions of given elements thanks to the activity of ancient stars. He's arguing against himself again.
And another unique thing is that we're seeing them on the crust of the Earth, not deeper inside the core of the Earth, which we had always thought and expected the Earth was running by. The core, the nuclear synthesis and the production of uranium powering our Earth's core is no longer true either.
What is he saying here? What is the argument? Uranium, among other elements, is in part responsible for some of the thermal energy produced by the Earth, by its radioactive decay. But what is Ramat's argument? That that's no longer true because of these Proton 21 laboratory experiments? How does that follow exactly? As for why we find most of the uranium in the crust rather than the rest of the layers of the Earth, uranium is actually lithophilic and chalcophilic. It doesn't readily combine with molten iron, but it does readily combine with other elements like sulfur and oxygen. This means it forms compounds which are less dense than pure uranium and allows it to rise to the surface, carried up to the crust by the mantle. Then Ramat jumps topics yet again, moving on to helium in granite.
So why is there still so much helium in granite and these zircon crystals?
Zircon crystals.
This argument has become less popular these days, but it still does pop up on AIG and ICR every now and again. The argument is pretty simple. Helium diffuses pretty quickly from zircon crystals, so you have these little crystals and there is helium sort of indigenous to the crystal, and after the crystal forms, the helium begins to seep out because it's a pretty slippery little element. So, given the diffusion time that we typically see and estimate, the fact that there is still helium in some zircon crystals is argued by young Earth creationists to be support that the Earth is much younger than conventional science would have you believe.
One explanation that was given by the RATE team is that radioactive decay was accelerated at some point in the past. We say this was during Noah's flood. So a prediction was made, and the numbers were run based on the diffusion rates at 1,000 degrees from helium in lower rock layers. How long would it take for that to seep out? And the creation model predicted, which would be on the data line right up here, which was what was observed, and the uniformitarianism was not met by a factor of 100,000. They were off by that much. Our model lined up perfectly if you take it and you go assume around 6,000 years, give or take 2,000. And the numbers lined up well with our model, but it didn't come anywhere close to the uniformitarianism thing.
Okay, it's time to talk about the RATE team. Back in the late 1990s, a group of young Earth creationists decided to challenge the idea of the ancient age of the Earth by forming the RATE team, Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth. Their goal was to basically debunk radiometric dating. What they found in the first phase of their two-phase sort of mission is that, one, it sure does seem like a lot of decay has happened in the rocks, and that's really where they came up with the idea for accelerated nuclear decay. So they looked at the rocks and they were like, tons of decay has happened. The Earth can't be that old, so it must have been accelerated. And they, of course, provided several other sort of adjacent supports to their idea, including things like radio halos, carbon-14 where it quote-unquote shouldn't be, and helium in zircon crystals. Interestingly, one of the most important conclusions by the RATE team is that while they did think accelerated nuclear decay had happened, they also noted that that would produce so much heat that they needed a miracle or new future physics with exotic new changes to be discovered in order to actually make it work. But we're going to talk about the helium in zircon crystals first. Russell Humphreys, the point guy on this whole thing, went to Fenton Hills and took a bunch of zircon crystal samples from there, and based off of the amount of helium that he says he detected, he deduced that the Earth must be only 6,000, give or take 2,000 years, and he proposed that the sort of conventional science model is off by the order of magnitude that Matt mentioned, producing that lovely graphic. So what's the deal with all this? Now, on the face of it, this seems like a good argument to make. I like the graphic. Allegedly, there have been predictions made prior to the actual sampling, but unfortunately for young Earth creationists, Dr. Kevin Henke, a geologist who's been on this channel before, has done some digging, and I think he blows this thing right out of the water. Kevin Henke details this on his blog in a very long piece that has yet to be fully analyzed and responded to by Humphreys, and he notes that young Earth creationists generally refuse to rectify a few issues with the helium argument. One, they don't recognize the presence of NICEs in their samples. They fail to account for possible contamination of zircons with extraneous helium during cooling and non-heating episodes. They balk at realistic QQ0 results that account for more variables. They use an incorrect equation to calculate standard deviations, and much, much more. Humphreys' methods are also plagued with issues such as trying to identify rocks merely by relying on naked eye observations, improper naming of rock units, and sloppy handling of units of measure. In fact, even Matt's presented graphic is bogus. Leschelt et al. In 2008 effectively ran Humphreys' expectations model with significantly more variables taken into account, and found that it is actually the young Earth creationist model that flounders in the face of data. Again, put simply, the rate argument works if you ignore the conditions found at the sample site, fudge comparative data, use the wrong equations, sample rock incorrectly, reject certain data points, handwave uncertainties, and ignore criticism. Rescuing device, cries the young Earth creationist, be it on YouTube or one of the big boys. Well, no, actually, because Dr. Henke actually has math and several lines of equations to back up his criticism of Humphreys' work. That means it's a counterpoint, not a rescuing device, which is an empty claim without any empirical support to back it up. In fact, Dr. Henke has laid out his challenges to Humphreys quite plainly, so why hasn't he, AIG, or ICR answered them?
And now we have experiments that can show, and observationally, that these things really can decay rather fast. And here is going back to that Proton 21 laboratories, which shows that the decrease in the activity of radioactive isotopes of cobalt and silver and zinc. So they show that these radioactive elements can decay rapidly into these elements, and they can decay even further from there based on temperature.
Now, it might seem like I'm jumping around a lot and that I've done some editing, but this is pretty dang close to Matt's straight presentation, so that should really let you in on how all over the place he is when giving this information to us. Now, Matt doesn't seem to know that the blurb that he's got on the screen there is talking about gamma decay, not beta decay, which to my understanding is kind of irrelevant for his overall point. And of course, he again doesn't appreciate that the Proton 21 lab stuff requires the conditions present in a plasma or the belly of a star to work. So the heat problem is just still there. Next, Matt is going to talk about the Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor. This is a natural reactor that is found in Gabon and is dated to 1.7 billion years ago. It's fascinating to me that this got brought up because I've only ever seen Oklo brought up as a slam dunk argument against young Earth creationists due to its stunning evidence that decay rates seem to not change, at least over the past 1.7 billion years. Modern nuclear reactors need enriched uranium, focusing on uranium-235, which is needed in large amounts for a reaction. Natural uranium, the kind that can be mined, is a mix of uranium-238 and uranium-235. At Oklo, we actually find the remains of fission products in the ore, as well as an unusual uranium ratio. 1.7 billion years ago, the natural uranium had a concentration of about 3%, which could have easily reached criticality with natural water and neutron moderators allowed by the special geometry of the deposit. This is incredibly strong support for the continuity of decay rates. So why would Matt bring them up?
The Oklo natural reactor phenomenon found in Gabon, Africa, contributes meaningful insights into the evaluation of their radioactive decay rate consistency. Because what they did is when they found this, they actually assumed that humans must have lived hundreds of thousands of years ago to make this nuclear reactor. That's what they have to assume, because these things, they believe, never happen naturally on their own. So they had to assume that humans must have lived at some time in the past and created civilizations like we have today, and then global warming came and destroyed them. But in the process of it, we had nuclear fusion going on. We had natural reactors that we had produced.
That sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Who is saying this, Ramat? Who is proposing it? Because it's called the Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor, which seems to suggest to me that people know that humans living 1.7 billion years ago didn't make it.
So that was the rescue device for that one, is just assume that we've already been here before and we destroyed ourselves, probably with nuclear war.
I thought it was global warming.
And then global warming came and destroyed them.
He can't even keep his incoherent straw man straight when he's invoking them within 10 seconds of one another. In all seriousness, like, the joke here is that the Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor is such a massive support for conventional science and so devastating to young Earth creationism that they just have to, like, pretend that it's not an issue, as we saw with Ramat here. Even Walt Brown puts it in his difficult to cope with column.
And then we have the perplexing 90% of all radioactivity on the Earth's crust, on the continents. Like, why would that be? So what are they doing on the crust of the Earth? If these things are powering the Earth's core and they're slowly moving up to the surface through convection and being dumped out at the mid-Atlantic ridge and forming into mountains slowly over millions of years, this would be the opposite of what we would see, especially considering they say our Earth is young.
We know why radiogenic elements like uranium, thorium, and potassium are concentrated in the continental crust. They simply have large ion radii, or simply their atoms are too big, that they do not fit well into the stable high-density atomic arrangement of rocks building the mantle layer, and so they're forced to separate with other rejected elements into buoyant melts, or magma. Such geochemical properties of elements are known as incompatibility. They concentrate in the upper continental crust because granitic melts are the end product of magma fractionating, and during the crystallization, their structure becomes more compatible.
We have the observational science that when we look at rocks that have opposite sides dating at different ages.
Give a single source for this.
But what it turns out is that the excess amounts of argon is a direct function of both the hydrostatic pressure and the rate of the cooling of the lava rocks when they form underwater. So keep that in mind. This is underwater we're talking about. That means that submarine basalt are not suitable for potassium-argon dating.
Okay, cool. So scientists know that we need to use caution when we're applying the argon-argon or potassium-argon method to samples like basalts when these basalts have been exposed to certain conditions. This is cool and important to know.
Now, how do they date a lot of these things? How do they date lava rock? With exactly that, potassium to argon.
Okay, I see what he's going to do. He's going to try to debunk the Mid-Atlantic Ridge argument. So I'm going to tell this for those of you who may not know, who might be new here, because it's a fun argument against young Earth creationism to whip out against your friends and colleagues. So the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is this sort of neon yellow, neon green line that runs down the center of the Atlantic Ocean. And at this ridge, there's seafloor spreading occurring. So these plates are moving away from one another, and magma wells up at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, cools, becomes rock, and then it is replaced by the magma beneath it, so it's pushed to the side. So this being the case, we get older radiometric dates farther away from the ridge on either side, and the closer you move to the ridge in sort of a horizontal line, the younger the dates get. And this is true no matter where you are on the ridge, which is really interesting. So we can radiometrically date a spot, let's say here, sort of on the left side of the ridge, and we can say maybe it's 8 million years old according to the rock. Well, how can we support that using another method? And that method is actually the movement of the tectonic plates, because the plates of the Earth are moving at predictable rates. They're moving at 1.7 inches per year. And we can know this because we have GPS, right? And we've also got folks up in space. It's really, really easy to record, and we have an incentive to do so because monitoring the movement of the tectonic plates is important for things like earthquake safety. So it turns out that if we've got our spot here that's 8 million years old, and we wind back the clocks on the tectonic movement to whenever this 8 million year old spot would have been over the mid-Atlantic ridge, the tectonic rate matches the radiometric date. That should not be the case if radiometric dating doesn't work, because these things are completely disparate from one another. They're independent methods. God would have had to accelerate nuclear decay in lockstep rather, with the movement of the tectonic plates, which is really, really silly and deceptive. So let's see how Raw Matt wants to do this.
The evolutionist goes, well, we need to go over and look at the mid-Atlantic ridge, right? Because we see the older dates farther away from the ridge. So therefore, it must be millions of years because that's what the dates are doing. Now we know that when lava pours forth and it drops down into the water, it's giving false ages.
Okay, I see. So he's using the argument from before that argon-argon dating and potassium-argon dating of certain basalts exposed to certain conditions, usually those being in seawater, can give incorrect, artificially inflated dates. Point taken, Matt. So here are two papers that support the age of the mid-Atlantic ridge at various sections and corroborate it with the movement of the tectonic plates using uranium-lead dating and fission tract dating. Ooh, that sucks.
So it explains the mid-Atlantic ridge discrepancies that we would, or what we would call discrepancies, that make it appear as though it's millions of years when it's just not.
Back to the drawing board, I guess, huh, Ron Matt? Guess you gotta find a way to find a problem with the actual ways that we date the mid-Atlantic ridge, and not just the ways you think it might have been dated, huh? Ramat talks briefly about a professor who says people are incentivized to find the oldest dates. And yeah, in the world at large, people are often incentivized to find the blankiest blank. It does give you some notoriety and something to sort of hang your hat on. But by that logic, everybody who isn't that person with the current oldest date has an incentive to debunk the person with the oldest date, right? So I'm gonna leave that one there and let Ramat move on to say one of his stupider ideas, which he has expressed before, and I've ridiculed it for him in that context. I'm gonna ridicule him again for it now. I'll let him explain.
We always ask, well, why are the oldest dates in the deeper layers? And this is very easily answered by the atomic mass and weight of the elements. You would expect that the heavier elements would sink deeper and the lighter elements would be on the top. And that's exactly what we see.
Hey, pal. You just blowing from Stupid Town?
Okay, I know what you're thinking, but it gets worse.
So if the whole world was underwater at one time and everything was being sorted out and the layers were forming, by different tidal waves moving in and out and slowly submerging the entire world, you're going to get different layers of rocks based on the currents of water that are washing in and out. But one thing that would always occur after everything is submerged in water is those denser elements would eventually seep to the deeper layers of the upper crust of the earth and be concentrated in random areas, but they would always be deeper. And what do we see? We don't see a uniformitarianism example of radioactive elements across the crust of the earth or deep in the earth. Instead, it's dispersed randomly on certain continents and less over in some other areas. It makes no evolutionary sense. And then on top of it, we find exactly what you would expect if the world was flooded, based on water hydrologically sorting different elements that would push heavier ones deeper and lighter ones would stay on top. It only makes sense when you're looking at these radioactive elements.
Are you serious?
Okay, so we have several problems here. The first being the failure of the public school system. Density and atomic weight, or atomic mass, are two different things. Uranium has a greater atomic weight than osmium, but osmium is more dense. If Noah's flood sorts by density, then osmium should be on the bottom, followed by iridium. If it sorts by atomic weight, then we should have uranium at the bottom of the geologic column universally across the world wherever it can be found. In conventional science, geology doesn't work like a child's sand toy because systems are dynamic. But the bigger issue is that neither density nor atomic weight have anything to do with radiometric dating, which deals with the ratios of isotopes within a sample thanks to decay. This is why we can argon-argon date two samples from different places in the same geologic column and get two different dates. They were formed at different times. But in Ramat's fantasy world, all argon should be universally found at given locations in the geologic column. He wants elements to do the job of index fossils. This is just another classic example of Ramat knowing less than a high school student who took earth science.
And then at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge again, what do we see? What we would expect to see. What's at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge? It's a lava. It's pouring out to this day. You can see it. It's lava that was higher as it pushed up, and now as it's coming down the Mid-Atlantic ridges and it's being pushed out and it's forming the new ground as it leaves in this slow process that we see today, which was faster in the past. What would you expect to see? We would expect to see exactly what we do see.
If anyone can decipher what he just said, I'm all ears.
Everybody knew exactly what I was talking about.
Ramat starts talking about how the age of the Earth is assumed, and that's why the evidence seems to support it. The only reason why the evidence seems to support it. Why won't anybody look for evidence for the flood? Now, as we talked about, this is patently incorrect. The age of the Earth being very ancient started because people looked at the rate at which things were occurring today geologically, and then looked at massive structures that would have taken a very long time to form if we took current processes and took them back in time. Radiometric dating simply corroborated the idea of an ancient Earth. No assumptions, just observations.
If you throw away the assumption and you only go by the observational evidence that we now have, then that can just be thrown away entirely. So there is no need to start with a horrible assumption just to make your point, especially when it's been invalidated. But we have the evidence that is completely necessary to invalidate any radiometric dating as being good for a dating method.
Radiometric dating, the process itself, has a few assumptions. For instance, we assume that when rocks form, they are all parent material, something we've never seen violated in all our years of observing rocks form through volcanic eruptions and the like. We assume that the final product is all daughter material, something we've never seen violated in all our years of observing full decay chains. They always end up being all daughter. And we assume that decay rates are constant on the basis of observed half-lives. So those all seem pretty well founded to me, unless Ramat perhaps has an issue with half-lives.
I'm sure it's completely fine to say, we looked at this decay rate and the half-life is really accurate. And I agree, it is. It would make a great watch. I would use one. But it doesn't prove that the Earth is millions of years old because it's, again, starting with that initial assumption. So it's true that the watch is ticking at a particular rate, and that's a fine rate, and it works really good. However, that watch will never tell you when it was made. You can only use it as a watch to tell time, not when it was created.
This just makes no sense. Radiometric dating is like if you have a watch that starts ticking the second it is created and stops ticking forever once 12 hours have passed. If you accept that the watch starts at 0 seconds having passed and ends with 12 hours worth of seconds having passed, and you accept the rate of ticking, then you accept that we can determine the age of the watch at any given moment.
So that brings us now back to the idea of the heat problem.
Oh, good. How does this relate to the heat problem?
Reduce your expectations to 0.
Now, Ramat is about to explain Walt Brown's hydroplate hypothesis to you. In hydroplate proposed by Walt Brown, this is a more fringe idea. The pre-flood world, the world before Noah's Ark, is like a giant ocean of superheated, super pressurized water underneath a granitic crust, a big shell, over the entirety of the Earth, completely unbroken, no tectonic plates. And this granitic crust, the crust of the Earth, is like 10 to 60 miles thick. The flood starts due to tidal pumping from the moon. You don't need to know what that is, but it basically ruptures, forms a bunch of seams down the ends of the Earth, down to the ends of the Earth, and from these seams, the fountains of the Great Deep burst forth and carry a ton of rocks and earth debris into the atmosphere, where some of it leaves the atmosphere entirely and becomes, I kid you not, the asteroid belt, the comets, and the meteorites, as well as, according to some interpretations, being responsible for the cratering of all the planets in the solar system all the way out to Pluto. Now you might be thinking, where's the rain come in? Well, the water has to fall back down, and according to Walt Brown, it gets cooled off being up in the upper atmosphere. That's actually not true because it only makes it to the thermosphere, falls back down as rain, and floods the Earth. And eventually it recedes, and you go from having granite on top, water on the bottom, to mostly water on top and granite on the bottom, that being the new mantle. but I do want to let you know that he has it incorrect as far as the source for the heat problem under hydroplate. Remember, Walt Brown tacitly admits that his model produces the equivalent of 5,000 trillion 1 megaton H-bonds worth of energy. That's a lot, and it comes from a lot of different places. The number that Walt Brown gives is basically the energy required to launch all the material on Earth into space in order to account for all of the asteroids and comets and meteors, which he thinks comes from Earth rock. But he also has a heat problem with accelerating the nuclear decay. He has a heat problem with the friction of the continents atop his version of the mantle. He has a heat problem with the accumulation of all the impact events when all of this material comes back down and creates all of the craters within the geologic column. He has a heat problem with the hardening of magma and the concretion of limestone. You could go on and on and on with the sources of heat for the heat problem. I just point to accelerated nuclear decay because it's the funniest and it's the easiest. But let's let Rahmat explain how he thinks hydroplate works for you, and then we'll dissect it a little bit.
The heat problem comes from a factor that Walt Brown had, and it was this idea that God didn't create any radioactive elements. So when he made his prediction, he said, these radioactive elements that are in the Earth today, they cause health problems when you're near them. So God must have never made these things. They must have been formed during the flood. So in his flood model, he created that the continent of the United States fell 1 mile down and pressed on the subterranean water that was underneath the continent. And in doing so, created so much heat with that water and the compression and the convection that was pushed down that it generated supercritical water to force over the rock. And as it was moving past the granite basement level rock with this massive amount of heat, it was going over the quartz crystal and it was creating a piezoelectric effect. And this piezoelectric effect caused lightning to spark, which is known as a Z-pinch. And it was bolting inside of this water and creating these new super heavy elements, which generated and formed massive amounts of heat. And now the supercritical water burst forth, going through the ocean in some parts and maybe even on land in some others, but most likely the ocean. And as it burst up going through into the ocean, caused massive amounts of heat. So the heat problem in Walt Brown's model comes from the formation of these super heavy elements from that process.
Okay, so like we said, the heat problem is more than just that. But to Rahmat, it's primarily the formation of these super heavy elements that rapidly decay into the regular old heavy elements, which then have to undergo accelerated nuclear decay to get to their current ratios. Now, remember, in order to invoke the Z-pinch and the piezoelectric effect, it's just the piezoelectric effect, by the way, but in order to invoke all of that, you need an Earth that is in a plasma state, right? All the experiments that utilize these methods are mimicking the interior of a sun.
And that Z-pinch process also comes with a reduction of heat, which is called cold repacking. And this is the process where the heat is actually reabsorbed back into itself rather than released.
So the phrase cold repacking doesn't actually appear in the Proton 21 laboratory work, but the idea is that it's like adiabatic, right? That it just reabsorbs the heat that it releases. I'm not a chemist or a physicist. I'm not sure how that works under regular conditions. But for our purposes here, it literally doesn't matter. Because in order to get that Z-pinch, the Earth, again, has to be in a plasma state. And then after that, you have to accelerate the nuclear decay of the newly created elements. And I don't know if Rahmat knows this, but Proton 21 proposes the cold repacking solution. And for the accelerated nuclear decay, Rahmat is invoking the rhenium-osmium experiments, which don't have cold repacking. So you just have a regular old accelerated nuclear decay heat problem at that point. And Walt Brown, of course, requires another piezoelectric effect in order to initiate that accelerated nuclear decay. So you get a piezoelectric effect that creates all the radioactive elements, and then a second piezoelectric effect that accelerates the nuclear decay. Both of those events require plasma conditions in and of themselves. But the second one is the one where you have to additionally add on the accelerated nuclear decay heat because it doesn't have the cold repacking.
So that would reduce a lot of the heat that would be dumped into the ocean and into the air itself, creating steam. But there was massive amounts of heat in his model simply from the continent falling down that far, pushing up the water and rock of the crust of the Earth and actually shooting debris all the way to the moon.
Well, okay, so now Rahmat is basically saying that friction is what is responsible for all the heat. I thought it was the creation of the radioactive elements that was the main reason. Of course, these are both reasons for the heat, along with accelerating the nuclear decay, hardening the magma, making the limestone, launching all of the material, the impacts when the material comes back down. It's all a big mess. Again, Walt Brown's number is equivalent to 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs total, which is, just to put this in perspective, over 600,000 hydrogen bombs per square kilometer. This is untenable.
And as far as the other model, which is not the hydroplate theory, but the catastrophic plate tectonics, they don't have that heat problem. Their heat comes from accelerated nuclear decay.
Catastrophic plate tectonics, which is a more mainstream idea held by Answers in Genesis and ICR and CMI. It's proposed by John Baumgartner. It's basically catastrophic plate tectonics, so plate tectonics but fast, right? So you do all of the plate tectonics in a single year of the flood, and you get a heat problem from this because of the friction, obviously, of those tectonic plates moving at race car speeds atop the mantle and crashing into each other. You still have to accelerate the nuclear decay. You still have to include all of the impact events, but it's not as extreme as hydroplate. To compare them brutally, in CPT, you vaporize the granite crust of the Earth a few dozen times over. In hydroplate, every single square kilometer of the Earth gets its own 600,000 hydrogen bombs. Okay, so now he's telling us that in catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT, the sort of rival to hydroplate, that the heat is just from accelerated nuclear decay. It's also a problem for hydroplate.
So based on what the rocks are right now at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, if that were to be subducted, then yes, that would generate a lot of heat. So it's based on the heat being generated from what we would see today.
But also the friction of the plates.
John Baumgartner didn't predict that the rocks that we see on the below the ocean right now is the rock that was there. He said there was a different type of a rock.
Oh, okay, the rocks were different. I see.
And there was also a different type of viscosity that was going on, so the subduction was much easier.
Yeah, and the viscosity was different, of course. Just the concept of viscosity was different.
And it could have literally been like an iceberg floating on water, which would have not produced as much heat from convection and subduction and grinding on top of one another. So it would have been much easier to subduct. And it happened just over 1 year, making it very easy.
To be clear, CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, the flood model that AIG holds to, has basically every issue that hydroplate has, except for the creation of the elements and launching all the material to basically be responsible for all the cratering in the solar system and all of the asteroids and meteorites and comets and things like that. It is still catastrophic, much like its name, in that you end up vaporizing the granitic crust of the Earth 24 times over, but we're not talking about over 600,000 bombs per square kilometers worth of energy here.
So there's multiple answers to the heat problem based on the model that we're talking about.
Nope, both models are completely dead on arrival for the reasons I just mentioned.
Here on this channel, we like to take everybody's position and defend them. But we're also going to mention that if they bring up something that they created their own problem for their own model, then we're going to give you an answer to how to resolve that problem, and then also why it's not really a problem at all, because they invented their own problem. That doesn't need to be there, people. It just doesn't. It's not a problem because he invented his own problem.
Ramat's just salty that Walt Brown thinks that God wouldn't have created the radioactive elements, and this has become problematic for him personally. Sure, whatever. Maybe God made them, maybe he didn't. You still have to accelerate the nuclear decay itself, and thus you have every single heat problem from before minus the creation of the elements. It is still completely impossible. Again, 5,000 trillion 1 megaton hydrogen bombs. Over 600,000 hydrogen bombs per square kilometer, okay? Okay, so now Standing for Truth is going to tell us some things. Let's hear him out.
But I want to point to something very simple that basically demolishes this whole argument from dating methods. I want to focus a little bit on radiocarbon and carbon dating in general.
Beating this old drum again, eh, boys? I've already covered radiocarbon dating to death. I actually did a pretty long video on it. It was a bite-sized bust. I discussed how radiocarbon dating actually works, how it is corroborated by numerous other independent methods, including varves, tree rings, and ice cores. Still have not heard back on that one, by the way, why these things so neatly corroborate one another. If they're all events that supposedly happened after the flood, you can't exactly invoke stepwise decay changes and rate changes, can you? But, like, here we are again, and Donnie is still invoking the same old arguments. He is undergoing, utilizing, abusing the Donnie deals fallacy, which was actually named after him. This is an argument style, a fallacious argument style that goes kind of like this. Donnie says young Earth creationism works, and then I say, no, young Earth creationism cannot work because of the heat problem. And he says, oh yeah? Well, accelerated nuclear decay. And then I say accelerated nuclear decay cannot work because of encyclopedic list. And then he says, oh yeah? Well, have you considered accelerated nuclear decay? It's just the reassertion of the original argument without actually addressing the critiques of that argument. And this is really what Donnie is doing for the majority of his role in this video.
So my point is, we have so-called rocks, fossils, coal, fossilized wood, so on and so forth, and diamonds that evolutionists want to say are millions to billions of years old. And if that really is the case, then there should be no carbon detected in these samples, okay? There should be no carbon left.
So there he reiterates a point, as we've already discussed.
And so, as you can see here in this slide, sourced from Contested Bones, one of my favorite books here.
Donnie would say that. He hates the paleo experts so.
I mean, there goes evolution. You can't take your fish to fishermen, your bacteria-like organism into biologists, your pond scum into people, unless you have billions of years old. That's why evolutionists believe, whether they admit it or not, that time is the hero of the plot for, goo to you type evolution, okay?
I would actually absolutely agree that deep time is required for evolution. In fact, evolution was built on the back of Charles Lyell's work. Darwin had a copy of the Principles of Geology when he was on the voyage of the Beagle.
I want to point out, we've done full videos. We've never gotten any counters, any rebuttals, any refutations, as you know, Matt, where we went over extensively all the rescue devices. I mean, this is a fatal blow.
Okay, so here we go again with the rescuing devices. I'm always wary when young Earth creationists use this word because it is almost exclusively them who use it, and it is pretty much only invoked when, like, some young Earth creationists claim from the 80s is proven to be non-problematic based off of advancing science. As we discussed earlier, a rescue device is not the same thing as a counterpoint or new data coming to light. So you can't call it a rescuing device unless it's baseless, and if it is not baseless and is thus a counterpoint, you subsequently have to show why the counterpoint doesn't work, believe it or not. That's how an argument works, at least, in civilized, real discourse.
We spent a lot of time going over the rescue devices, a couple of them being, for example, contamination. Okay, they've looked at contamination of these samples. That doesn't work. These have been repeated. Many different samples have been sent in. They've been tested, and they come back with, detectable levels of radiocarbon. This isn't just, a couple anomalies.
A Donnie Deals fallacy. I say that radiocarbon dating works and is problematic for young Earth creationism. Donnie says, no, radiocarbon dating doesn't work because we find radiocarbon in places where it ostensibly should not be. Then I say, well, sure, but there are natural processes that can account for this radiocarbon in these places, things like cosmogenic radiation, intrusion by groundwater, and just bad sampling. And then Donnie responds with, yes, but have you considered that we have found radiocarbon in places that it shouldn't be? He's not addressing the counterpoint. He's just crying rescuing device and reasserting the original point.
And the question that I would have, and in the debate with Professor David McQueen and King Crocoduck, King Crocoduck was saying, well, we would expect, a dozen or so anomalies. But we have a lot of anomalies. And the question is, how many anomalies does it take before we conclude, these dating methods are a fraud? They're not reliable, okay?
Well, actually, when we take into account how many samples are dated every single year, corroborating other methods and being corroborated by other methods, I would argue that yes, it is literally just a couple of anomalies, and I personally have yet to see a single one that is not explainable by some kind of natural means, and thus it's not really an anomaly, it's bad sampling or bad methods. things of this nature. Barring the fact that we don't actually have many anomalies, again, I would propose I've never seen one, interestingly enough, you would actually need a metric shit ton of them before you could go on and decry that radiometric dating as a whole is worthless. Recall that King Crocodile, KC, who's a biomedical physicist, mentioned in his debate with David McQueen that mammography often has false positives, and yet no one is going around saying that we should ditch mammography whole cloth. And here's the kicker, right? When we do have positives in mammography, or we have positives that we're unsure of, we can do a biopsy to corroborate whether or not it truly is a positive or not. This is analogous, I would say, to independent methods that we use to corroborate radiometric dating. I mean, I just don't think there's that many anomalies, though. I don't think we even need to appeal to this. Of course, I understand why young Earth creationists might be under the impression that we have several anomalies, but I would point out that at least Answers in Genesis frequently misconstrues what's actually going on there.
So these samples, though, that they've looked at, they are subjected to very harsh treatments. Okay? They're basically subjected to harsh acids, and contamination is limited, essentially.
I think Donnie also doesn't understand what contamination is. His bit here makes me think that Donnie is under the impression that contamination is always physical residue on the sample. And no.
They are applying very, very strict pre-treatment protocols. I pointed out they're utilizing harsh washings, repeated harsh washings and strong acids. And these are the kinds of acids that will literally dissolve anything. Okay. And since these samples, guys, are hit with multiple treatments, this essentially ensures only carbon intrinsic to the sample ends up in the instrument to be measured. Okay. So no, these samples are not contaminated.
See, no. Right? The most common type of contamination is cosmogenic radiation, so contamination from the sun. It's like background radiation on a sample. In fact, I mentioned this in a video, didn't I?
The most common source of contamination, background radiation from the sun, is well understood. In fact, cosmic rays form beta radiation all the time. This is the radiation that turns nitrogen-14 into carbon-14 in the first place. It used to be that this radiation could not be totally eliminated from the laboratory, so one could probably have gotten a radiocarbon date of 50,000 years from a pure carbon-free piece of tin. For this reason, radiocarbon dating didn't work well on objects much older than 20,000 years at the time, because such objects have so little C14 left that their beta radiation is swamped out by the background radiation of cosmic rays and potassium-40 decay. However, the modern advent of AMS, or accelerator mass spectrometry, allows us to accurately carbon date material as old as 60,000 years. This is thanks to the number of techniques that have been developed to correct for these confounding factors, which are, contrary to creationist literature, well understood.
Good luck washing the sun off in an acid bath, Donnie.
And they'll claim that there's other nuclear material down where the diamonds are that can basically recharge the C14. This doesn't work. Okay, this has been looked at, this has been analyzed, it's been systematically demolished. Okay, the rate scientists, for example, they looked into this rescue device and they estimated, okay, listen to this, they estimated that you would need 13,000 times more nuclear material in the nearby rocks in order to adequately recharge the C14.
Yeah, except that just does happen. Your boy George actually admitted this in a video that came out after this one. And George's response to the fact that we found cases of contamination to the degree that they do account for the amount of carbon in a sample is, oh yeah? Well, prove that's the case for every single time a creationist has asserted it then.
So I challenge Jordan, publish the paper, go to the sites where the creationists obtain their samples, measure the uranium and thorium in those samples, and then you calculate your own, C14 volumes out of those samples.
No, that's your job. You're the one trying to fight the paradigm here.
All these rescue devices, they've been demolished, but the critics don't want to tap out.
Well, I don't really think so, because you were arguing with straw men. You say that it can't be contamination because that's washed off in an acid bath, but the contamination is radiogenic. You argue that recharging by surrounding materials can't occur, and yet it can, and you didn't explain why that method was flawed, merely that the guy who did the work for you, Jordan, friend of the channel, should go ahead and run the test for all the samples that you want tested. You're the one trying to challenge the paradigm. Quit being lazy and do the work yourself instead of relying on the charity of someone who disagrees with you. Prove that this carbon is truly intrinsic and supports a young Earth instead of being contaminated by one of the many different ways that this can occur. You could go to the site. You could show that uranium isn't present in the surrounding minerals and capable of recharging the carbon. You could show that cosmogenic radiation didn't happen and that there was no percolation by groundwater. You could correctly characterize the site so you know that sampling is appropriate, and then you could take it to a correctly calibrated AMS. There are literally thousands of samples that are getting radiometrically dated across 150 radiometric dating labs, and that's just for carbon dating, each and every year across the entire world. So the young Earth creationist case for discordant dates absolutely has to be rock solid if you want someone to take you seriously for even a nanosecond.
Notice this table from secular sources, secular data. Young rocks from recent eruptions yield greatly exaggerated apparent ages. So Matt, my question to you, my question to the audience, why should we have confidence? Why should we trust dates derived from rocks of unknown age? Or, okay, when we can't even derive accurate dates of rocks of known age?
I don't know how many times I have to say this. You cannot radiometrically date brand new rock. Any geologist knows that you can't do this. An undergraduate geologist would understand that you can't do this because not enough parent has actually decayed into daughter material to be detectable outside of the error bars of a given method. This is just how it works. However, when enough parent material has decayed outside the error bars of a given method, we get pristine calendar dates, which is how we used argon-argon dating to get the calendar year for the Mount Vesuvius eruption, matching the historical records of the site. This should not happen if radiometric dating does not work. And Mount Vesuvius is older than every single one of the dates on the screen there, except for one. So I got curious and tracked it down. First of all, that little chart there is stolen from Andrew Snelling, who is a geologist and should probably know better. But what's really curious to me is that those are proposed to be the secular dates. So therefore, I went to Snelling's original paper, which was from 1998, and I looked up what method he used, or which citation he used and what method they used, and lo and behold, it was potassium, argon, and argon-argon dating. And it all seems to be on basalts. And I seem to remember a very prestigious scientist telling me that you can't actually use potassium-argon dating or argon-argon dating on basalts that have been inundated or suffused with seawater.
That means that submarine basalt are not suitable for potassium-argon dating.
They just debunked themselves again. I don't even need to be doing this job. They do a fine enough job making themselves look bad on their own without my help. And while we're at it, contested bones for just outright lying yet again. And also, Snelling got most of his work from Dalrymple. So I tracked down that paper, and guess what it's about? Excess argon! Now, because potassium-argon dating relies on unstable potassium decaying into argon, we shouldn't see detectable amounts of argon in these samples after accounting for atmospheric argon. Now, some of Dalrymple's samples actually did have excess argon and gave an artificially inflated date. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do we know that that's not happening with all dating methods? And the answer is because they should not corroborate each other. And these sort of aberrant dates weren't corroborated by other methods. That's part of how we knew that they were aberrant. But let's listen to Professor Ramat for a second and say that argon-argon dating and potassium-argon dating always end up having some excess argon. That's going to give us a maximum of 1 million year buffer, so the Earth, congratulations, is 1 million years younger than the 4.5 billion years that we suppose it to be. Not too much help if you're a young Earth creationist, huh? Now Donnie is going to go on and talk about how excess helium, fission tracks, and radio halos are evidence for accelerated nuclear decay.
This physical, empirical evidence, right, Matt, that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred. And as we know, byproducts of radioactive decay include helium. You touched on that. Helium's an extremely slippery molecule, yet we find it in zircon crystals, as you were talking about, fission tracks, and radio halos that essentially suggest accelerated decay, probably at creation and the flood. Okay, both periods of time. The creation week was an accelerated week, accelerated processes. Any kind of accelerated decay during that time period would be followed by accelerated cooling. Okay.
Oh, accelerated cooling, eh? Just made that up, did ya? Just gonna make stuff up. Guys, accelerated cooling is not a thing. Donnie could have just sat there and proposed a temporary magic time bubble. These two things are equivalently sci-fi. Now, I suspect that Donnie must be reading the rate team's work as of late because he's been on a real kick about the stuff that they proposed. Fission tracks, radio halos, and excess helium. These have all been on Donnie's short list as far as arguing for accelerated nuclear decay. Now, keep in mind, the rate team argued that at least 4.5 billion years worth of decay has happened. They just think it had to happen very, very fast. And to make things easier on themselves, they actually propose that accelerated nuclear decay has happened twice. They think it happened during the creation week, but then the last 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay happened during Noah's flood. And this is what Donnie's been on about recently. He thinks they've got solid evidence that accelerated nuclear decay did happen. Not that it can, not that it might have, but that it did. So put a pin in that because we're going to address that at length at a later date.
I've never seen any real sufficient response from the critics on this. Gutsick Gibbon attempted, and we did a full-out response to her response over a year ago at this point. There's never been a sophisticated rebuttal.
Yeah, I probably didn't watch it, but again, put a pin in accelerated nuclear decay having happened. Suffice it to say, it did not, and I'm going to show you why, but not yet.
And it's like the heat and energy that they say is a problem is a great way to get the plates moving in the first place.
So this is a quote from Lyle, and it's wrong. If you want to utilize heat to propel something like the continents and get them to move at race car speeds, literally race car speeds, then that heat needs to be directed, right? If I fill a big canister up and stick it to a rocket and ignite it, it's not going to direct the rocket to fly, it's going to explode. Without a nozzle, like a Delaval nozzle, to actually direct the energy to propel the rocket, you are SOL.
Accelerated decay has happened. Okay, that's the most important point.
No.
Nope. He goes on another accelerated nuclear decay spiel and how there's all this proof for it. That's getting its own video because I want to make sure he sees it. I will put a link to it in this video when it's done.
Can you cover this concept of Z-pinch, for example, and how there would be something, I think it's called cold repacking, where you'd have basically a canceling out effect of any kind of excess heat that would be damaging? Go ahead, brother.
Oh, good. Ramat is going to explain to us how we can get cold repacking without the Earth having to be a plasma as a prerequisite. Okay, go ahead. I'm all ears.
Reduce your expectations to zero.
Yeah, there was obviously heat that was generated. There's no doubt about that. Why? Because we realized we found in genetics that all the aquatic life died at the same time. So there was a global bottleneck of not just land life when the flood happened. It destroyed the life in the ocean as well. Why do you think there's things like megalodons that are missing and these prehistoric creatures and whales that are no longer with us? Something killed them.
Well, okay. Was there heat or not? Because Donnie's just spent several minutes telling us that, like, there is no heat problem. Like, there just is not a heat problem.
There is no heat problem, guys.
Something, whether it's miraculous or future physics or something McQueen's got up his sleeve, something dissipated the heat. Your accelerated cooling. But now here's Ramat saying that there was heat, and a lot of it. In fact, there was so much heat that it killed most marine life. I mean, like, putting aside that makes no sense, because how is heat going to differentiate between sea life, right? Why did it kill all the megalodons and ichthyosaurs, but it left all of the cetaceans, your whales, and even your big sharks? But also, they can't decide on whether there's a heat problem or not, right? Or whether there's even a massive amount of heat or not. Ramat says yes, Donnie says no. Which is it?
It had to have been the heat. You know, nothing else that we can think of did it. So obviously massive amounts of heat would have done the job, but it didn't kill all of them. It just killed most of the life.
There is no heat problem, guys. There is no heat problem, guys. There is no heat problem, guys.
It had to have been the heat.
Hey, yo, what the f***? There's no heat problem.
And a lot of it was buried in the flood. So we know the global bottleneck happened in genetics, so now we want to find it in the geologic record. We see it. The only discrepancy that we see is based on the idea that the Earth is old because of these radiometric dates. And again, there's multiple ways to that the planet could have absorbed the heat or gotten rid of it, but it also comes down to how much heat was generated. And again, that goes back to what was the plates, what was going with convection, what was going on. Is the Z-pinch even needed? Well, in Walt Brown's model, it is needed. Because again, it goes down to, he believed that the radioactive elements had to be produced in the flood. So he needs Z-pinch to do that. But why? There is no need for radioactive elements to have been there. Like Donnie mentioned earlier, God created things during creation week. Accelerated nuclear decay could have happened in the first week before there was even life on the planet. And the first days of creation, when he's creating the foundations of the world and he's creating the mountains and everything, guess what? That's accelerated. That's when the process was really happening and occurring. There was no life to even hurt, so it wasn't a problem. And then we get to the flood, and then there's plate tectonic movements, and that's what I would say the heat would be generated from.
Okay, so let me see if I got this right. Ramat proposes that God creates the Earth 6,000 years ago, and on day 3, whatever the day is before the animal and plant life shows up, God decides to accelerate nuclear decay in a massive way during a time period where it can't possibly hurt any of the critters that might be around. And then, once the flood arrives significantly later, the flood is responsible for shuffling all of these accelerated, decayed blocks of rock into their current order. And then the heat problem is thus from the friction of the continents moving around and dropping 10 miles or whatever the hell is happening in Walt Brown's model. He's gone back and forth. Where does the heat come from, you guys? You don't have a coherent model. You're changing your mind every couple of sentences, and it makes it very difficult to debunk, actually. I wonder if this isn't a strategy. But anyways, this doesn't make any sense. The whole reason that young Earth creationists put at least the past 500 million years worth of accelerated nuclear decay into the flood is because they have to explain the ordering of these radioisotopes, right? Why are they stacked the way they are in the rocks? And they can't exactly appeal to hydrologic sorting like they can with animals or ecologic sorting. So they have to have some reason. So usually they accelerate the nuclear decay during the flood itself. But Ramat here is suggesting that I guess there wasn't accelerated nuclear decay during the flood. The flood just shuffles the layers that have already been laid down and the decay of which was already accelerated during creation week. Okay, so riddle me this. How exactly does that work with the fact that they are in order with extinct animals mimicking evolutionary order in deep time? Right? Why did the flood shuffle them in that way? Again, you can't hydrologically sort your elements. They don't sort by density and atomic weight like Ramat would have you believe. It doesn't make any sense. This is why the rate team doesn't propose that this happened. And also, if it did, then Ramat's earlier idea should be true, right? We should see sorting. It should be by density, right? The iridium layer that we find in between the extinction of the dinosaurs and the rise of the mammals shouldn't be 65.5 million years ago. It should be at the very bottom if Ramat is proposing that the flood scoops up all the sediment in the geologic column that existed when God created the Earth, mixes it all up, and then resettles it out, ordering it by density. So why is the iridium not on the bottom? Actually, why isn't the osmium on the bottom, followed by the iridium? But moreover, again, none of this has anything to do with radiometric dating, right? Radiometric dating is not related to density and atomic weight in the way that Ramat is trying to make it seem here. This would be like if I took a bin full of Pokemon cards and I threw it into the lake and suggested that naturally they would sort themselves by type. Right? It's all Charmanders on the bottom. This is stupid. It's ridiculous and it doesn't make any sense. Ramat goes on to give a gibberish summary of cold repacking again.
But if we want to defend Walt Brown's position, then yes, if Z pinch occurred during the flood in his model, there's a process called the cold repacking, which is a process where the heat is actually reabsorbed into the surrounding elements when it's formed. The very granite would have taken it back inside of itself because granite would have absorbed it. The crystalline structures, which would have been producing this electrical effect, would have been reabsorbed back into the granite as the heat was generated from the electricity that came from the granite. So the heat would have been produced and then absorbed again. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And that's very helpful in the model.
I'm not even sure he knows what cold repacking is at this point. You can cold repack to your heart's content, but if the conditions to get cold repacking require the Earth to be in a plasma state, you are SOL on the whole, like, Noah's Ark thing. Then he goes on to talk about the moon and radiocarbon dating, the latter of which we've already talked about, and the former of which is completely off topic and has nothing to do with anything. And then he says this.
Tells you what? Their evolution concept and mindset is a religion. They want it to be true. All this conflicting evidence that refutes the idea, they just ignore it. They don't want it to be true. They're anti-science. Why? Because if they were scientifics, they would go, ooh, show me that. Let me learn about that. I'm going to study that and figure out what's really going on here. Why are there discrepancies? That's what we did. We believed in evolution, and now look at us. We looked at the evidence and said, wow, that doesn't make any sense. I can't believe what they told us was just nonsense and a lie. That's why their science textbooks are replaced every 5 to 10 years. What you learned in school is not even taught anymore because it's just been replaced with nonsense that's going to be replaced in 10 more years. And they're just going to say, well, we learned more. Yeah, no, what you did is you've been falsified time and time again. That's not science. When you get multiple falsifications wrong, that shows you how weak your model is, how weak your theory is. If it's not getting anything accurate, throw it away.
Schizo posting on Maine.
Now, one thing we do here, Matt, as you know, is when we model build, because, you know, we strongly believe here in Stand for Truth Ministries in refuting the evolutionary model, just dismantling all their best arguments. That's why we've written books specifically dealing with their favorite lines of evidence, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, for example, and just the other, 15 books or so that we've put out, including our books on the flood. And so we'll combine the strengths of each flood model, right, and discard a lot of the weaknesses that aren't necessary based on false assumptions, right? So we have a combined model, essentially, and that's presented in a lot of our videos.
I'm sorry, a combined model?
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit.
What, you're gonna take different parts and create a hybrid between CPT and hydroplate? Oh my god, you can't actually do that. Models are created with interdependent parts. You can't just mix and match them like Legos. Take the parts that work. That's the most brain-dead thing I've ever heard in my life.
Which model you think out of these two prevailing ones, the CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, versus the HPT, the hydroplate theory, which one of those models do you find personally to be the stronger one in light of its strengths and weaknesses?
Ooh, tough questions.
They literally contradict each other. What can you even say to this? Tough questions indeed. It's not workable. Walt Brown's model, which they seem to want to take the idea of predictions from, and also I think the piezoelectric effect, starts with the Earth having a giant granitic crust that's 10 to 60 miles thick, seeded over like supercritical ocean water underneath, like a big, stupid eggshell. You literally cannot have subduction under the hydroplate model, and subduction is a principal component of CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, which is just regular plate tectonics, but sped up. It makes very similar predictions to regular plate tectonics with regard to where the continents should be today if they started as a supercontinent. That's one of the advantages of CPT. This is a mathematical issue because these two ideas are diametrically opposed to one another. The hydroplate predictions are completely different from this and have, of course, been falsified by other young Earth creationists. A guy named Edward Isaacs, who is also a young Earth creationist, ran through the incorrect predictions of plate tectonics that hydroplate makes and has, of course, been proven wrong on. I believe he mostly concerns himself with Brown's ideas on where the trenches should be and, of course, where they are not located today. And then you've got Brian Nickel, who is a hydroplate acolyte who is very adamant, again, that subduction just doesn't happen. And like CPT, again, needs it to. CPT is also okay with the fact that the continents are still moving today, whereas hydroplate, not so much. So we've got all these like mechanical issues here where these two models are interdependent within themselves, right? They have different variables that depend on one another to make sense. And as a result, they are not able to be parsed. You can't just pick and choose little pieces from them. You can't have both subduction happening and the release of water be from the rupturing of an unbroken granitic crust around the surface of the Earth. It just doesn't work.
With Walt Brown's predictions, he has over 60. Most of them are on the flood model, and he's nailed most of them.
7. Walt Brown says that 7 of his nearly 60 predictions have come to fruition. And honestly, most of those 7 are also suspect.
You have to mix them. You just have to. It's so good to mix the two because I think they're both amazing now. I was more Walt Brown, and then I started going like, I can't explain the layers of the flood with Walt Brown, so I have to use the other one now.
So it's here that Rahman and Donnie kind of tucker themselves out and decide to end the stream. Wow. Yikes. Oof. I saw this and I was so blown away by the content that I mentioned earlier, it's like junk food to me. I couldn't help myself. I had to make a video on this. If I like eating junk food, then this is the equivalent of like a mukbang. I cannot fathom putting this out into the eternal ether of the internet for everyone to see forever and not die from the lethal amounts of embarrassment. But what I really couldn't believe even more than that is the fact that there was a follow-up video to this. They did it again! And the follow-up, oh, you guys, it's got some juicy stuff. For one, Donnie formalizes his challenges about radio halos and fission tracks, and he then just says that if those sort of geologic items can be explained, he will just admit that the heat problem is currently unsolved. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that he would just give me this gift. It's like early Christmas. They also went on about cold slabs and my explanation for them in a previous video and why my explanation is bad and dumb actually. And I have such a treat for you guys with regard to that. I'm so excited to share it. They also talked about a ton of other brand new nonsense. It was just like a junk food bonanza, and I have such a sweet tooth. For my New Year's resolution, I've really got to swear off of it for a while. Anyways, I hope I don't need to tell you that this video did not have the old brain trust decimating dating methods and the heat problem. Instead, rather, it was a masterclass in bungling that can really only be described as a failure to understand basic physics on one end, and on the other end, a failure to understand other young Earth creationists and the ideas that they're putting out. It's always fun to watch Rahman and Donnie fumble around science terminology for about an hour. This was actually a relatively short one, and by fun, I mean excruciating. So it's about the end of the year, and I've decided to treat myself a little bit because I think that the videos that come after this one warrant some content. I am going to indulge in comparing and contrasting hydroplate and CPT. This is just completely removed from the standing for truth brain trust in general. But I would also like to cover Donnie's challenge, his fission tracks and his radio halos, and sort of its own isolated coverage. And I think it's going to be very fun. We also, of course, have to talk about a little bit about their new video with Bond and McQueen and Donnie sitting around talking for 3 hours and 15 minutes. There's a lot to cover, really. So my gentle and, of course, very modern apes, get excited. It's going to be a happy holiday.